The morning sun barely crept through the blinds of the military briefing room as Captain Riley Thompson stepped through the heavy metal doors. Her boots clicked against the polished floor, each step echoing in the tense silence that always filled these pre-mission spaces. 23 other pilots sat in neat rows, their flight suits pressed and their faces showing that familiar mix of excitement and nerves that came before any major operation. Riley had been here countless times before, but today felt different. Today she could feel the weight of every sideways glance, every whispered comment that stopped just as she walked by. At 28, she had already proven herself in smaller missions, but this was the big leagues. This was the kind of operation that made careers or ended them. She found her assigned seat in the third row and sat down quietly, pulling out her mission notes. The paper was already worn from her studying it the night before, going over every detail until she could recite the target coordinates from memory. Around her, the other pilots chatted casually about weekend plans and football scores, their confidence obvious in every relaxed gesture. The room suddenly went quiet as General Williams entered. He was exactly what you'd expect from a military commander who'd spent 30 years climbing the ranks. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair cut military short and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His chest displayed rows of ribbons and medals that told stories of battles fought and won long before most of the pilots in the room had even considered military service. "Good morning," his voice boomed across the room without needing a microphone. 24 voices responded in unison. "Good morning, sir." General Williams moved to the front podium and opened a thick folder. "Today's operation is what we've been preparing for. High-value targets, significant strategic importance, and zero margin for error." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I'll be reading the pilot assignments and call signs for this mission." Riley's heart started beating faster. She knew what was coming, and she knew exactly how it would sound when he said it out loud in front of everyone. "Lieutenant Commander Johnson, call sign Hawk." A nod from the front row. "Major Peterson, call sign Thunder." Another acknowledgement. "Captain Rodriguez, call sign Steel." The list continued down familiar territory. Then came her turn. "Captain Thompson, call sign." General Williams paused, his eyes scanning the paper as if he couldn't quite believe what he was reading. "Butterfly." The silence that followed lasted only about 3 seconds, but it felt like an hour. Then General Williams did something that Riley had hoped wouldn't happen but had expected anyway. He chuckled. Not a mean laugh exactly, but the kind of sound someone makes when they think they've just heard something amusing. "Butterfly?" he repeated, this time louder, his eyebrows raised. "Well, that's a first." A few pilots in the front rows started grinning. Someone in the back let out a quiet snicker. Riley felt her cheeks warm, but she kept her expression neutral. She'd been through this reaction more times than she could count, and she'd learned that the best response was no response at all, at least not the kind they expected. General Williams shook his head with what looked like bemused disbelief. "I have to ask, Captain Thompson, how exactly did you end up with a call sign like that? Did you flutter around during training?" This time the laughter was more open. Even some of the more serious pilots couldn't help smiling. Riley stood up slowly, maintaining perfect military posture. "Sir, the call sign was assigned during advanced flight training after my first combat simulation exercise." Her voice was steady, professional, and loud enough for everyone to hear clearly. "And?" General Williams prompted, clearly expecting more of an explanation. The training instructor felt that my flight pattern during the exercise resembled. She paused for just a moment. "The movement of a butterfly, sir." More laughter rippled through the room. Someone muttered, "That doesn't sound very threatening." General Williams nodded, still wearing that amused expression. "I see. Well, I suppose we all have our unique qualities." He glanced around the room, sharing the moment with the other pilots. "Though I have to say, when I think of effective call signs, I usually think of names like Viper or Razor or Thunderbolt, something that might actually intimidate the enemy." "Maybe she can confuse them to death," someone called out from the middle of the room, causing another wave of chuckles. Riley remained standing, waiting for permission to sit back down. Inside, she was remembering the day she got that call sign, though the story was quite different from what everyone assumed. It had been during her final qualification at Top Gun training school. The exercise was a complex air-to-air combat simulation against some of the best pilots in the program. Riley was flying against an instructor who had never lost a training engagement in over 2 years. The other trainees expected her to follow standard attack patterns, to play it safe and conventional. Instead, Riley had done something unexpected. She'd used an unconventional flight path that took her aircraft through a series of rapid altitude changes and direction shifts that looked random and chaotic from the outside. Her movements seemed erratic, almost delicate, like she was dancing through the air rather than fighting, but there was nothing random about it. Every turn, every climb, every dive was calculated to throw off her opponent's targeting systems while positioning her for the perfect shot. When the exercise ended, she had achieved what no trainee had done before. She'd gotten a clean lock on the instructor and won the engagement. The instructor, a gruff veteran named Colonel Hayes, had been so surprised that he'd asked her to explain her strategy during the debrief. When Riley described her approach, he'd listened carefully, then nodded with grudging respect. "Most pilots fly like hammers," he'd said. "Straight, hard, predictable. You fly like a butterfly. Looks gentle and harmless until you realize it's exactly where it needs to be, exactly when it needs to be there." The name had stuck, but not for the reasons everyone always assumed. "Well," General Williams continued, bringing Riley back to the present moment, "I suppose we'll see what our butterfly can do in real combat conditions." He said the call sign with just enough emphasis to make it clear he found it amusing. "Though I have to admit, I'm curious to see how this plays out." Riley finally sat back down as the general moved on to the next name on his list. Around her, she could hear quiet conversations starting up. "Butterfly? Seriously? How did she even make it through training with a call sign like that? Maybe they're trying some new psychological warfare strategy." Riley pulled out a pen and started making notes on her mission brief, blocking out the comments. She'd heard variations of these conversations for 3 years now, ever since she'd graduated from flight school. The reaction was always the same: surprise, amusement, and then the assumption that she must not be a serious pilot. What they didn't know, what none of them had bothered to find out, was that in every training exercise, every simulation, every practice mission she'd flown, Riley had consistently scored in the top 5%. Her accuracy ratings were among the highest in her class. Her tactical decision-making had earned praise from instructors who weren't easily impressed. But none of that mattered in moments like this, when everyone was focused on a call sign that sounded like it belonged to a children's cartoon character rather than a combat pilot. General Williams finished reading the roster and moved on to the mission details. As he spoke about target coordinates and tactical objectives, Riley found herself studying the faces around her. These were good pilots, experienced and skilled. But she could see in their expressions that they'd already written her off as the weak link in today's operation. That was fine with her. She'd been underestimated before, and it usually worked to her advantage. People who didn't take her seriously tended to make mistakes, and mistakes in combat were opportunities. As the briefing continued, Riley began to see something that the others might have missed. The mission parameters were complex, with multiple targets spread across a wide area. The conventional approach would be to divide the targets among the pilots and execute coordinated strikes. But there was another way, a possibility that would require precision timing and unconventional tactics, the kind of approach that most pilots would consider too risky or too complicated, the kind of approach that a butterfly might take. General Williams clicked a remote control, and the lights dimmed as a massive projection screen descended from the ceiling. The room filled with the soft hum of electronic equipment coming to life. What appeared on the screen made every pilot in the room lean forward in their seats. It was a satellite image of a desert compound that looked like something out of a military thriller. Concrete bunkers dotted the landscape like gray scars against the tan sand. Guard towers rose at strategic points, their shadows creating dark lines across the photograph. But what caught everyone's attention were the massive defensive installations that surrounded the entire complex. "Gentlemen and lady," General Williams nodded toward Riley, "meet your target. This facility has been operational for over 2 decades, and in that time, it has never been successfully penetrated by airstrike. The image zoomed in, revealing more details. Riley could see vehicle tracks crisscrossing the sand, evidence of regular patrols. Solar panels glinted from rooftops, showing that this wasn't some abandoned outpost. This was a fully functioning, heavily defended installation. The intelligence reports indicate approximately 40 high-value targets within this compound. The general continued, using a laser pointer to highlight different areas. Communications equipment, weapon storage facilities, command centers, and personnel quarters. Our job is to eliminate as many of these targets as possible in a single coordinated strike. Captain Hayes, one of the more experienced pilots, raised his hand. Sir, what's the current record for target elimination in a single mission? General Williams smiled, and Riley could tell he'd been waiting for someone to ask that question. Good question, Hayes. The current record was set in 2003 by Major Rodriguez, call sign Hawk. 17 confirmed targets in one sortie. That record has stood for 20 years. A murmur of appreciation went through the room. 17 targets was an impressive number, especially considering the difficulty of confirming hits during active combat operations. Rodriguez was flying an older generation aircraft with less advanced targeting systems, the general added. With today's technology, we have the potential to exceed that record significantly. Riley studied the screen intently, her mind already working through the tactical challenges. The compound was roughly rectangular, about 2 miles long and 1 mile wide. The defensive positions formed concentric rings around the central structures, with the most valuable targets concentrated in the middle. The conventional approach would be obvious to anyone with military training. Divide the pilots into 3 groups, assign each group a section of the compound, and execute simultaneous strikes from different angles. It was a solid plan that would likely succeed in eliminating most of the targets. But as Riley examined the defensive layout more carefully, she began to notice something that the others might have missed. The enemy has adapted their defenses based on previous attack patterns, General Williams was explaining. They expect conventional approaches from the north, south, and east, where the terrain provides the best cover for incoming aircraft. He clicked to the next slide, showing radar coverage patterns. As you can see, their early warning systems are designed to detect aircraft following standard attack vectors. However, there are limitations to their coverage. Riley's pen moved quickly across her notepad as she sketched the radar patterns. She could see the gaps, small windows where the coverage overlapped imperfectly. Most pilots would consider these gaps too narrow or too dangerous to exploit, but Riley was beginning to see possibilities. Lieutenant Commander Peterson, you'll lead Alpha Team from the north, General Williams announced, beginning the tactical assignments. Your targets are the communications array and the northern guard towers. Peterson nodded confidently. He was a solid pilot with over 100 combat missions under his belt. Major Johnson, you'll take Bravo Team from the east. Your objectives are the main weapon storage facilities and the motor pool. More nods around the room. The assignments were logical, playing to each pilot's strengths and experience levels. Captain Rodriguez, Charlie Team comes in from the south. You're responsible for the command bunker and the southern defensive positions. Riley waited, knowing her assignment would come last. She had already guessed what it would be. Captain Thompson, General Williams looked directly at her. You'll provide aerial reconnaissance and backup support, monitor enemy movements, and assist any team that encounters unexpected resistance. There it was. The support role. Not because she lacked the skills for a primary assault position, but because no one wanted to risk putting the pilot with the cute call sign in charge of critical targets. Riley simply nodded. Understood, sir. But inside, her mind was racing. The support role would actually give her something the other pilots wouldn't have: a complete view of the entire battlefield. While they were focused on their specific target areas, she would be able to see the bigger picture. General Williams advanced to the next slide, showing detailed floor plans of the major structures. Intelligence indicates that the enemy has reinforced their position significantly since our last reconnaissance flight 6 months ago. Expect heavier anti-aircraft fire than shown in your briefing materials. Captain Hayes raised his hand again. Sir, what's our estimated mission duration? Total. Flight time should be approximately 2 hours. with active combat engagement lasting no more than 30 minutes. We want to hit hard and get out before they can coordinate a meaningful response. Riley continued studying the tactical display, her pen moving across her notepad in quick strokes. She was creating her own map, one that showed not just the targets and defenses, but the timing sequences that would be critical to mission success. Most military operations relied on coordination and simultaneous action. But Riley was beginning to see the potential for something different. What if, instead of hitting all the targets at once, someone could create a cascade of destruction, hit the right targets in the right sequence, and each successful strike would create opportunities for the next one? The communications array, for instance, wasn't just a target. It was the enemy's ability to coordinate their defenses. Take that out first, and the remaining defensive positions would be operating blind, unable to share information about incoming threats. Similarly, the power generation facility wasn't just another target. It was what kept the automated defense systems running. Eliminate the power, and half of their anti-aircraft capabilities would go offline immediately. Riley looked around the room at her fellow pilots. They were all focused on their individual assignments, studying their target areas, and planning their attack runs. None of them seemed to be considering the interconnected nature of the compound systems. Questions? General Williams asked. Captain Rodriguez raised his hand. Sir, what's the weather forecast for the target area? Clear skies, visibility unlimited, winds from the southwest at 15 knots. Perfect flying conditions. Riley had a question of her own, but she hesitated to ask it. Finally, she raised her hand. Yes, Captain Thompson. Sir, what's the timeline for target assessment? How quickly will we know which targets have been successfully eliminated? General Williams looked slightly surprised by the question. Battle damage assessment will be conducted in real time using drone surveillance and pilot reports. Why do you ask? Just want to understand how quickly I might need to redirect support if any team encounters problems, sir. It was a reasonable explanation, but it wasn't the real reason for her question. Riley was thinking about timing, about the possibility of adapting tactics in real time based on changing conditions. Good thinking, Thompson. That's exactly the kind of situational awareness we need from our support pilot. The briefing continued for another 20 minutes, covering emergency procedures, communication protocols, and extraction plans. But Riley's mind was already moving beyond the standard procedures. She was thinking about the gaps in the radar coverage, about the cascade effects of targeting infrastructure, and about the fact that her support role would give her the freedom to operate independently if the situation called for it. As the other pilots filed out of the briefing room, discussing their assignments and coordinating their approaches, Riley remained in her seat for a few extra moments. She stared at the tactical display, memorizing every detail. 20 years. That's how long Major Rodriguez's record had stood. 17 targets in a single mission. Riley looked down at her notepad, where she had sketched out a different kind of mission plan, one that didn't divide the compound into sections but treated it as a single, interconnected system. One that used unconventional approaches and precise timing to create maximum impact. It was risky. It was complicated. It would require split-second decision-making and perfect execution. It was exactly the kind of mission that a butterfly might fly. The sound of jet engines filled the morning air as 24 F-16 Fighting Falcons roared to life across the tarmac. Riley sat in her cockpit, running through her final pre-flight checks with the methodical precision that had become second nature over her years of flying. Her hands moved across the instrument panel, each switch and button as familiar as the keys on a piano. Radio check, came the voice of Flight Commander Blake over the communication system. All pilots report in. One by one, the call signs echoed through Riley's headset. Thunder ready? Steel ready? Hawk ready? When her turn came, Riley keyed her microphone. Butterfly ready. She could almost hear the smirks in the brief silence that followed. Even now, strapped into millions of dollars worth of military hardware and preparing for a combat mission, her call sign still drew reactions. The formation takeoff went smoothly. 24 aircraft lifting into the clear desert sky in perfect coordination. Riley found her position in the support formation, flying slightly higher and behind the main assault groups. From here, she had a clear view of the entire flight pattern spread out below her. The flight to the target zone took 45 minutes, during which Riley had plenty of time to study the terrain passing beneath her aircraft. The landscape was mostly empty desert, broken by occasional roads and scattered settlements. But as they approached the target area, she could see the compound rising from the sand like a man-made mountain. "Target area in sight," Flight Commander Blake announced. "All teams, prepare for final approach." Riley watched through her canopy as the 3 assault teams began their separation maneuvers. Alpha Team, led by Peterson, banked north. Bravo Team, under Johnson, headed east. Charlie Team with Rodriguez turned south. The plan was unfolding exactly as briefed. "Butterfly, maintain your position and monitor all team frequencies." Blake's voice crackled through her headset. "Report any unusual enemy activity." "Copy that, Falcon Leader," Riley responded using Blake's call sign. She settled into her orbit pattern, circling the compound at a safe distance while keeping all 3 assault teams in visual range. Through her targeting system, she could see the enemy compound in perfect detail. Guard towers, defensive positions, and the various target buildings, all exactly where the intelligence photos had shown them. For the first 10 minutes, everything went according to plan. The assault teams approached their designated entry points, maintaining radio silence as they prepared for their coordinated strike. Riley monitored enemy radio frequencies, listening for signs that their approach had been detected. Then everything went wrong in the span of 30 seconds. "Missile launch! Missile launch!" Peterson's voice exploded over the radio, filled with alarm. "Alpha Team taking heavy fire from concealed positions." Riley immediately turned her aircraft toward the northern approach, where she could see smoke trails from surface-to-air missiles streaking across the sky. 2 of Alpha Team's aircraft were maneuvering desperately, deploying flares and chaff to confuse the incoming missiles. "Bravo Team, abort your approach." Johnson's voice was tense. "Multiple bogies coming up from the east. We've got enemy fighters in the air." Riley's heart rate spiked as she processed what was happening. The intelligence had been wrong. The enemy wasn't just defending with ground-based weapons. They had fighter aircraft hidden somewhere nearby, and they were launching a coordinated counterattack. "Charlie Team, we're taking heavy anti-aircraft fire," Rodriguez reported. "They've got more defensive positions than shown in the briefing." Through her radio, Riley could hear the chaos of aerial combat. Pilots calling out missile launches, warning each other of threats, coordinating evasive maneuvers. The carefully planned mission was falling apart. "Alpha 2 is hit. Alpha 2 is going down." Peterson's voice was strained. "We need immediate support." Riley watched in horror as one of Peterson's wingmen, Captain Morris, fought to control his damaged aircraft. Smoke was pouring from his engine, and his F-16 was losing altitude rapidly. Ejecting," Morris called out just before his aircraft exploded in a ball of orange flame. "This is Falcon Leader," Blake's voice cut through the chaos. "All teams withdraw to Rally Point Alpha. Repeat, all teams withdraw immediately." But the withdrawal wasn't going smoothly either. The enemy fighters were pursuing the retreating aircraft, and more surface-to-air missiles were launching from the compound. "Bravo 3 is hit," Johnson reported. "Engine failure. I'm trying to make it to the emergency landing zone." Riley could see Johnson's aircraft trailing smoke as it limped away from the combat area. Another pilot down. Another mission objective abandoned. "Charlie Team, we're being painted by multiple radar systems," Rodriguez called out. "They've got us locked up from 3 different directions." The mission was becoming a disaster. 2 aircraft down, multiple pilots in trouble, and not a single target eliminated. Riley orbited at her assigned distance, watching her fellow pilots fight for their lives while she remained safely out of range. That's when Flight Commander Blake's voice came over the radio, with an edge of desperation she'd never heard before. "Butterfly, this is Falcon Leader. All primary assault teams are compromised. We need to eliminate those targets before we lose any more aircraft." Riley's breath caught. Was he asking her to do what she thought he was asking? "Falcon Leader requesting clarification," she responded, trying to keep her voice steady. "Butterfly, you are cleared for immediate combat engagement. All primary targets remain active. You are authorized to engage at your discretion." The words, hung in the air for a moment. Riley looked down at the compound, which was now fully alert and bristling with defensive fire. Every anti-aircraft system was active. Every radar was searching for targets, and enemy fighters were still patrolling the airspace. It was exactly the kind of situation that military doctrine said to avoid. A single aircraft against a fully prepared, defensive network, with no backup and no support. It was also exactly the opportunity Riley had been preparing for her entire career. Copy, Falcon Leader. Butterfly is engaging. Riley pushed her throttle forward and pointed her F-16's nose toward the compound. As she descended from her safe orbit, she could feel her heart rate settling into the calm, focused rhythm that always came when she transitioned from thinking to acting. The other pilots had followed conventional attack patterns, approaching from predictable directions at standard altitudes. That's why the enemy had been ready for them, but Riley wasn't going to follow conventional patterns. She remembered the gaps in the radar coverage that she'd identified during the briefing. She remembered the cascade effect she'd mapped out, where hitting certain targets in the right sequence would create opportunities for subsequent strikes. Most importantly, she remembered why they called her Butterfly. "All aircraft, this is Butterfly," she announced over the radio as she began her approach. "I'm going in alone. Maintain safe distance and be ready to provide extraction support if needed." "Butterfly, that's suicide." Peterson's voice crackled through the static. "You can't take on that entire compound by yourself." Riley smiled grimly as she began her first evasive maneuver, dropping to an altitude so low that she was almost skimming the desert sand. Her aircraft disappeared from enemy radar as she used the terrain to mask her approach. "Peterson," she replied calmly, "you've never seen a butterfly hunt." Behind her, the voices of her fellow pilots filled the radio waves with concern, encouragement, and disbelief. Ahead of her, the enemy compound grew larger in her windscreen, its defensive systems tracking desperately for a target that kept disappearing and reappearing in unexpected places. Riley had studied this compound for hours. She knew every building, every defensive position, every potential weakness. More importantly, she had a plan that none of the enemy commanders would expect, because no pilot had ever been crazy enough to try it. As she approached the outer perimeter of the compound, flying so low that her jet wash was kicking up sand clouds behind her, Riley keyed her microphone one more time. "This is Butterfly, beginning attack run. Wish me luck." Riley's F-16 screamed across the desert floor at barely 50 feet above the ground, moving so fast that the sand below blurred into streams of tan and gold. Her aircraft's radar warning system was screaming alerts, but she ignored them. She knew exactly where the enemy sensors could and couldn't see her. The first gap in their defensive coverage was coming up in 30 seconds. Riley pulled back slightly on the stick, gaining just enough altitude to clear a rocky ridge that would hide her approach to the compound's eastern flank. As she crested the ridge, the full scope of the enemy installation spread out before her windscreen. It was even more impressive up close. Concrete bunkers and steel towers rose from the desert like a mechanical city. Anti-aircraft guns swiveled desperately, searching for her aircraft, but Riley was already changing direction again, diving back toward the deck and disappearing from their targeting systems. "Butterfly, we're seeing massive radar activity from your position." Flight Commander Blake's voice crackled through her headset. "What's your status?" "Still breathing, Falcon Leader," Riley replied, her voice calm despite the chaos around her. "Beginning target engagement in 10 seconds. She had memorized the compound's layout so thoroughly that she could navigate it blindfolded. Her first target was the communications array on the northeastern corner of the facility. It was a cluster of satellite dishes and radio towers that coordinated all of the base's defensive systems. Take that out, and the remaining defenses would be operating independently, unable to share information or coordinate their fire. Riley pulled her aircraft into a sharp climbing turn, gaining altitude rapidly as she approached the communications complex. Anti-aircraft tracers began streaming past her canopy, bright streaks of light that looked almost beautiful against the clear blue sky. "Target acquired," she announced, her finger hovering over the weapon release button. The targeting computer showed a perfect lock on the main communications building. "Fox 1, Riley called out as she released her first missile. The weapon streaked away from her aircraft, leaving a thin trail of white smoke as it guided toward its target. The explosion was spectacular. The communications building disappeared in a ball of orange flame and black smoke, taking the satellite array with it. Secondary explosions rippled through the complex as fuel and ammunition stores caught fire. Direct hit on communications array, Riley reported, already banking toward her next target. Enemy coordination should be disrupted. Through her headset, she could hear the excited voices of the other pilots who were watching from their safe distance. Holy cow, did you see that hit? She's actually doing it. Butterfly, you magnificent crazy person. But Riley was already focused on target number 2. The power generation facility was a low, rectangular building near the center of the compound. It supplied electricity to the automated defense systems, and destroying it would shut down half of their anti-aircraft capabilities. This approach was more dangerous. She had to fly directly over several defensive positions to reach the target, and without the communications array, the defenders were firing wildly in all directions, trying to hit anything that moved. Riley dropped her aircraft to ground level again, using a dry riverbed to mask her approach. The ancient watercourse curved around the southern edge of the compound, providing perfect cover until the last possible moment. Coming up on target 2, she announced, pulling into another climbing turn that brought her aircraft directly over the power plant. More anti-aircraft fire filled the air around her, but Riley had timed her approach perfectly. The defenders were still trying to track her previous position when she appeared over their heads from a completely different direction. Fox 2. Another missile launched, and another explosion rocked the compound. The power plant disappeared, in flames, and immediately Riley could see several of the automated gun towers stop moving as their electrical supply was cut. Power grid is down, she reported. Multiple defensive systems offline. Outstanding, Butterfly. Flight Commander Blake's voice was filled with admiration. How many targets is that? Riley was already counting in her head as she maneuvered toward her third objective. 2 confirmed, sir, moving to weapons storage facility. The weapons depot was the most dangerous target yet, because of what would happen when she hit it. Intelligence reports indicated massive amounts of ammunition and explosives stored in underground bunkers. If she could trigger a chain reaction, it would eliminate multiple targets simultaneously, but getting there meant flying through the heart of the compound's defensive network. Even with the communications and power systems down, plenty of manually operated weapons remained active. Riley chose the most unexpected approach possible. Instead of staying low and trying to sneak in, she climbed her aircraft to maximum altitude and dove straight down toward the target like a falling meteor. The vertical dive confused the remaining anti-aircraft systems, which were designed to track horizontal targets. By the time they adjusted their aim, Riley was already pulling out of the dive and lining up for her attack. Target 3 locked, she announced, watching her targeting display show a perfect solution on the main ammunition bunker. Fox 3. The missile struck the bunker's ventilation system, penetrating deep into the underground facility before exploding. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then the entire northern section of the compound erupted in a series of massive explosions that could be seen from miles away. The chain reaction Riley had hoped for exceeded even her expectations. Ammunition depot after ammunition depot exploded, in sequence, creating a rolling wave of destruction that eliminated 6 separate target buildings in less than 30 seconds. Multiple secondary explosions confirmed, Riley reported, her voice steady despite the awesome display of destruction below her. Count that as 8 targets down. Through her radio, she could hear the amazed voices of her fellow pilots. Mom, you see that? The whole north side just went up. 8 targets in one shot, that's incredible. She's already halfway to the record. But Riley wasn't finished. She had identified 17 more potential targets, and she had the ammunition and fuel to reach them all. More importantly, she had the element of surprise. The enemy defenders were in complete chaos. Their command structure disrupted and their defensive coordination shattered. Her next targets were a series of vehicle maintenance facilities along the compound's western edge. These buildings housed enemy transport vehicles and mobile weapons platforms. Riley approached them in a series of low-level attacks, using the smoke and confusion from the previous explosions to mask her movements. Targets 4 through 7 engaging now, she announced, releasing a spread of smaller missiles that struck 4 separate buildings simultaneously. More explosions, more secondary fires, more confusion on the ground below. Fuel depot next, Riley called out, identifying a cluster of storage tanks near the southern perimeter. This should be interesting. The fuel farm was heavily defended because of its strategic importance, but Riley had noticed something during her reconnaissance. The storage tanks were connected by a network of underground pipelines. Hit the right tank and the explosion would follow the pipelines to ignite the entire complex. She selected the central storage tank and lined up for a precision strike. Fox 4. The result was beyond spectacular. The entire fuel farm disappeared in a mushroom cloud of fire and smoke that rose hundreds of feet into the air. The explosion was so massive that Riley's aircraft was buffeted by the shock wave even from her safe distance. Fuel depot eliminated, she reported, though the understatement was almost comical given the size of the explosion. Butterfly, what's your current target count? Flight Commander Blake asked, his voice filled with amazement. Riley did quick mental math as she scanned for her next targets. 15 confirmed, sir. Still have targets of opportunity available. 15 targets. She was already approaching the 20-year-old record, and she wasn't done yet. The remaining targets were smaller but still strategically important. Guard towers, communications substations, vehicle checkpoints, and equipment storage areas. Riley went after them methodically, using her remaining missiles and then switching to her aircraft's cannon for precision strikes. Each target fell with surgical precision. Each explosion added to the chaos and confusion below. The enemy compound was rapidly becoming a burning wasteland, its defensive capabilities completely shattered. Target 21 confirmed, Riley announced after eliminating a radar station with a cannon burst. Moving to final objectives. She still had 2 missiles left, and enough cannon ammunition for several more passes. The compound still had targets available, though most of them were secondary objectives that hadn't been part of the original mission briefing. But Riley had come this far, and she wasn't going to stop now. Riley circled high above the burning compound, her fuel gauge showing just enough for the flight home. Below her, what had once been an impenetrable fortress was now a landscape of smoke, fire, and twisted metal. She could barely recognize the satellite photos from the morning briefing. The place looked like it had been hit by a natural disaster. Butterfly, this is Falcon Leader. Flight Commander Blake's voice came through her headset. What's your final target count? Riley took a deep breath and did one last careful count of the destruction below. She had to be absolutely certain because this number would be verified by satellite footage and drone surveillance later. Falcon Leader, final confirmed target count is 23. Repeat, 23 targets eliminated. The radio went silent for a long moment. Riley could almost picture the stunned faces of her fellow pilots as they processed what she had just said. Did she just say 23? Someone whispered over the radio, forgetting proper communication protocol. That's impossible, another voice murmured. Butterfly, confirm your count, Flight Commander Blake requested, his voice carefully controlled. You're reporting 23 confirmed targets. Confirmed, sir. 23 targets eliminated in a single sortie. The silence that followed was even longer this time. Riley used the quiet moment to check her aircraft systems and begin her climb to cruising altitude for the journey home. Her F-16 had performed flawlessly throughout the mission, despite taking minor damage from debris and shockwaves. Finally, Captain Peterson's voice broke the silence. Butterfly, you just shattered a 20-year-old record by 6 targets. 6 targets! The radio exploded with congratulations and amazed comments from the other pilots. Outstanding work, Butterfly. That was the most incredible thing I've ever seen. You made it look easy. But Riley barely heard the praise. She was thinking about the pilots who hadn't made it home. Captain Morris, whose aircraft had been shot down early in the mission. Captain Johnson, who was still limping toward the emergency landing zone with engine problems. The mission had been successful, but it had come at a cost. All aircraft, this is Falcon Leader. Blake's voice cut through the chatter. Form up for return flight. Johnson, what's your status? Engine's running rough, but I think I can make it back to base, Johnson replied. Thanks for asking, sir. Roger that. Butterfly, take point position for the flight home. I think you've earned it. Riley felt a warm surge of emotion at the gesture. The point position was traditionally reserved for the flight leader or the most senior pilot. By offering it to her, Blake was showing respect in the most meaningful way possible. The flight home took just over an hour, during which Riley had plenty of time to think about what had just happened. She had started the day as the pilot with the cute call sign, assigned to a support role because no one expected much from her. She was ending it as the holder of a new combat record that would probably stand for decades. But more than that, she had proven something to herself. All those years of dealing with skeptical looks and dismissive comments, all those training sessions where she had to work twice as hard to get half the recognition, all those moments when she had wondered if she really belonged in a fighter cockpit. It had all led to this moment. As the base came into view on the horizon, Riley could see a crowd gathering on the tarmac. Word of her achievement had obviously spread quickly through the base communications network. Ground crews, off-duty pilots, and support personnel were all waiting to see the pilot who had just made military history. Butterfly, you're cleared for landing on runway 09, the air traffic controller announced. And congratulations on your mission success. Even the usually professional air traffic controllers were breaking protocol to acknowledge her achievement. Riley brought her F-16 in for a perfect landing, her wheels touching down with barely a whisper of contact. As she taxied toward the flight line, she could see people lining the taxiway, many of them holding up cameras and phones to record the moment. When she finally shut down her engines and opened her canopy, the sound that greeted her was something she had never experienced before. Hundreds of people were cheering, clapping, and calling out congratulations. Ground crew members who usually maintained professional distance were grinning and giving her thumbs up. Riley climbed down from her aircraft on slightly shaky legs. The adrenaline was finally wearing off, and she was beginning to realize just how exhausted she was. Flying combat missions was physically and mentally draining under the best circumstances, and what she had just accomplished was far beyond normal mission parameters. The first person to reach her was her crew chief, Sergeant Martinez, who had been maintaining her aircraft for over 2 years. "Ma'am, I've been working on fighter jets for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just did," he said, his voice filled with genuine awe. "That bird performed perfectly because you flew her perfectly." Before Riley could respond, she was surrounded by other pilots from her squadron. Even the ones who had chuckled at her call sign that morning were looking at her with undisguised respect and admiration. "Riley, that was absolutely incredible," Captain Hayes said, using her real name instead of her call sign for the first time she could remember. "I've never seen tactical flying like that in my entire career." "How did you even think of that approach?" Captain Rodriguez asked. "Flying through those radar gaps at that altitude, timing those explosions to create chain reactions. It was like watching someone play three-dimensional chess at supersonic speed." Riley was about to answer when she heard a familiar voice cutting through the crowd. Make way, official business coming through." General Williams was walking toward her through the crowd of well-wishers, his expression unreadable. Riley immediately snapped to attention, suddenly remembering that she was still in a military chain of command despite all the celebration around her. "Captain Thompson," the general said when he reached her, his voice carrying across the relatively quiet crowd. Everyone wanted to hear what he would say to the pilot who had just accomplished the impossible. "Sir?" Riley responded, maintaining her attention stance. General Williams looked at her for a long moment, his weathered face serious. Riley could feel her heart beating as she waited for his response. Had she somehow violated mission parameters? Had her aggressive tactics put other pilots at risk? Then slowly, General Williams extended his right hand toward her. "Captain Thompson," he said, loud enough for everyone around them to hear clearly, "I owe you an apology." Riley blinked in surprise but remained at attention. "This morning I laughed at your call sign. I made assumptions about your capabilities based on a name that I thought sounded unsuitable for a combat pilot." The general paused, his hand still extended. I was wrong. Completely and utterly wrong. Riley finally relaxed her stance and reached out to shake the general's hand. What you accomplished today will be studied in military academies for years to come, General Williams continued. Your tactical innovations, your precision under pressure, and your courage in the face of overwhelming odds represent the very best of what military aviation can achieve. The crowd around them erupted in renewed applause and cheering. Furthermore, the general added, raising his voice to be heard over the noise, I want to make sure that everyone here understands something important. He looked around at the assembled crowd before focusing back on Riley. A pilot's call sign isn't about sounding intimidating or impressive. It's about representing who that pilot really is when everything is on the line. And Captain Butterfly Thompson has shown us today that sometimes the most unlikely warriors can achieve the most extraordinary victories. The general stepped closer and lowered his voice so only Riley could hear. 23 targets, Captain, in a single mission, against impossible odds. That's not just a new record, that's the kind of achievement that defines military legend. He stepped back and spoke loudly again. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the new holder of the single mission target elimination record, Captain Butterfly Thompson. The crowd exploded in cheers that could probably be heard across the entire base. Riley felt tears forming in her eyes as she looked around at all the faces, pilots, ground crew, support staff, and officers, all of them looking at her with genuine respect and admiration. Later that evening, after the debriefing sessions and the paperwork and the initial media interviews, Riley finally had a moment alone in her quarters. She sat on her bunk, still wearing her flight suit, and thought about the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. Her call sign had started as a joke, a way for instructors and fellow pilots to express their doubts about her abilities, but she had turned it into something else entirely. She had made it a symbol of the fact that strength and courage could come in unexpected forms. 23 targets. A record that had stood for 20 years, broken by 6. And it all started with a general who laughed at her call sign and ended with the same general acknowledging that he had never seen anything like what she accomplished. Riley smiled as she finally began to change out of her flight gear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new missions, and probably new skeptics who would need to learn the same lesson that General Williams had learned today.